Clarice, you don't deserve to step into my house." Brianna hissed those words as if she were taking out the trash right in front of the entire family right before Christmas Eve. And the moment her eyes slid toward the golden envelope in Clarice's hand, the one holding Harrison's final secret, I swear to you, I saw contempt and greed mixed together like poison. But just a few seconds later, right when Brianna thought she had successfully thrown her mother-in-law out of the family, Clarice tapped one button on her phone. Your $5 million account is now frozen. No yelling, no tears, just a verdict as cold as steel. Then Clarice lifted her head. "I'm not being cut out of this family. I just took my home back." And while Brianna was still frozen in shock, Clarice picked up her suitcase, walked out the door, and boarded a flight to Europe to meet the man who knew the truth about Harrison and about Brianna herself. Now tell me, if you were Clarice, would you swallow the humiliation or fight back? If your own daughter-in-law insulted you on Christmas, would you stay quiet? And do you want to know what was inside that golden envelope? Comment continue if you want the next part, and remember to subscribe so you don't miss the next twist. Clarice Miller had lived in her little wooden house in Vermont for 7 years since Harrison passed. The place still held his warmth, but over time, loneliness settled into every corner. On winter mornings, she brewed tea and stared at the snow-covered yard, the yard where Harrison once chopped firewood, where Evan used to run barefoot as a child. Every familiar detail only deepened what she had lost. Clarice lived slowly, quietly, keeping a gentle mask on her face, yet every night when the lights went out, solitude drained her like a slow leak in the heart. She told herself she was used to it, but some nights a single gust of wind was enough to make her chest tighten. Her own words echoed through her small kitchen. "I'm used to being alone, but it still cuts every day." She realized she didn't fear solitude. She feared being pushed out of the lives she once belonged to. What hurt most wasn't the empty house, but the growing distance from Evan. He had once hugged her and promised he'd never leave her alone, but bit by bit, Brianna took up every inch of his attention. Whenever she saw her daughter-in-law, Clarice forced a warm smile. Brianna, when Evan was around, played the perfect tender wife who held Clarice's hand and asked if she needed anything. But the moment Evan turned away, her expression hardened. Her eyes became cold, her tone clipped and polite to the point of insult. Clarice didn't need anyone to tell her she wasn't welcome. At the few family dinners they shared, all Brianna had to do was glance at her, and Clarice felt like the outsider at her own son's table. Veronica, Brianna's mother, made no attempt to hide her disdain. She barely managed a greeting. Once, when Clarice stepped onto her porch, Veronica looked her up and down and asked with a smirk, "Clarice, are you still lucid enough to drive yourself here?" The words sliced her pride like a thin blade. Clarice simply replied with a calm smile, "I'm far more lucid than you think." But the sting stayed with her long after she left. Yet despite everything, as Christmas approached, Clarice whispered to herself that maybe this year things would be different. She spent almost a week preparing. The kitchen smelled faintly of gingerbread. Small gifts lay neatly wrapped on the dining table. She even drafted a holiday message, hoping it would soften Brianna and Veronica a little. Clarice truly believed that if she kept showing kindness, the family would one day accept her. On the old wooden shelf, the golden envelope Harrison left her still rested unopened after 7 long years. Many times she had tried to break the seal, but every time her fingers touched its edge, a strange heaviness made her stop. That day, she slipped it into her coat pocket, the way some people carry a charm for courage, feeling as though Harrison was walking beside her into the holiday night. Clarice glanced at her reflection, fixed a loose strand of hair, and murmured, "Christmas will feel warm again." Dusk settled slowly. The porch lights flickered on, and her phone buzzed. Clarice set the tray of cookies down, a hint of excitement warming her chest. She thought Evan was asking if she was on her way. But when the screen lit up, the message staring back at her cut through every hope she had been holding on to. A text from Brianna. Only 2 words. "Don't come." In that moment, the quiet house felt like it froze around her. Clarice stood motionless as the cold glow of the screen illuminated her face, signaling the first crack of a storm she never saw coming. Clarice stood still for a long moment after reading the message, her mind slipping into a hollow loop. She looked at the gingerbread she had prepared since morning, the neatly wrapped gifts arranged on the table, and tried to make sense of the cold words staring back at her. Her daughter-in-law might not like her, but forbidding her to visit on Christmas, the one day meant for family, was something she could not explain away. The silence inside her house tightened around her ribs until she felt she couldn't breathe. Clarice grabbed her coat, held onto the gifts, and drove out because she needed a reason, any reason, to justify that message. She didn't want to endure silence anymore. The snowy road toward Evan and Brianna's house brought back memories of past winters when she used to arrive with a kind of excitement that kept her awake the night before. She always cooked Evan's favorite dishes, and Harrison used to joke that Clarice brought the Vermont winter with her every time she visited their son. Yet today, every mile she passed made her chest heavier. When the car stopped in front of the familiar house, Christmas lights twinkled along the roofline, a scene that contradicted everything waiting behind the door. Clarice had barely stepped onto the porch when the door swung open and Brianna appeared. She stood rigidly as though guarding a boundary, forcing Clarice to stop. Her eyes held none of the politeness she usually displayed around Evan. They were hollow, cold to the point of cruelty. Clarice tried to keep her voice steady as she asked, "Brianna, you told me not to come. Is something wrong?" The answer sliced straight through her. "Clarice, you don't belong in this house." It wasn't spoken out of irritation. It was a dismissal drenched in contempt, and Clarice felt the impact deep in her bones. She didn't even have time to react before Veronica's voice floated from inside, slow and sharp, like salt falling onto an open wound. "Old people forget things so easily. Better not come in and ruin the mood." A few relatives inside turned their heads toward Clarice. None of them asked if she was all right. None of them stepped forward. Their silence made the humiliation settle even deeper. Clarice felt as though she'd been brought to a public square to be pushed out of her own family. Brianna crossed her arms, her lips pulling into a thin, dismissive curve. Her gaze dropped to the pocket of Clarice's coat where the golden envelope rested. The corner of Brianna's mouth twitched upward, a brief flash of greed before it shifted back into irritation. Clarice recognized that look, the way people eyed something they wanted while pretending she was a burden. A bitter understanding began to take shape inside her, connecting threads she had ignored for too long. Layers of hurt pressed against her chest, but something else rose beneath it. A quiet, steely calm. Clarice reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Brianna's eyes flickered, a hint of worry showing before she hardened her expression again. Clarice opened the trust fund app, the one Harrison had given her full control of. Her hand trembled slightly, but her gaze sharpened. She looked straight at Brianna. "You want me out of this family? Then you don't need money from this family anymore." Her voice wasn't loud, yet the room fell silent. Even Veronica stiffened. Brianna let out a mocking breath, clearly believing Clarice was bluffing. But then the sound chimed from the phone, sharp and final. Ting! $5 million froze in an instant. Brianna's face drained of color, as if someone had ripped the mask off her carefully crafted composure. Veronica turned to her daughter with panic widening her eyes. Clarice remained where she stood, neither stepping forward nor stepping back. She finally understood that the power she had held all these years had never left her. She simply never had a reason to use it until tonight, when every last thread of respect she'd held onto was torn apart. The entire house sank into a thick silence. Then suddenly, Clarice's phone rang. Evan's name lit up the screen, catching her off guard. She lifted her hand to answer, but in that instant, Brianna lunged forward, ripping the phone from her grasp. Her face twisted in panic as she shouted, "You are not talking to her." And in that frozen moment on the porch, Clarice looked at her daughter-in-law and understood that she had stepped straight into the fear Brianna had tried so desperately to hide. And from here on, everything would unravel in ways none of them could imagine. That day, Clarice walked away from Evan's porch with a heart that had been torn apart, yet wrapped in a thin layer of steel she didn't know she could forge. She didn't realize what she had just endured was only a small fragment of a darker current that had seeped into the family long before she stepped onto that doorstep. While she drove away, inside the brightly lit house behind her, another story waited to be uncovered, one that began in the twisted past of Brianna and the woman who shaped her. Brianna's childhood had no softness in it. Veronica came from a family that worshipped dominance, and she passed that creed down to her daughter through sharp words that carved into Brianna's upbringing like a cold blade. Whenever Brianna hesitated, Veronica pushed harder. Whenever Brianna failed, Veronica didn't comfort her, she belittled her. And whenever Brianna showed vulnerability, Veronica delivered the same line, dropping it like a sentence that echoed through the girl's entire childhood. If you can't push people down, first they will crush you. That sentence became the warped compass guiding Brianna's view of the world. She learned to study people's eyes for weaknesses, learned to smile before striking, learned to hit precisely where it would hurt most. She grew into someone who moved through conversations like chess matches, always watching for the moment she could take the upper hand. A child raised in fear, taught to weaponize that very fear, becomes an adult whose gentleness dies before it ever forms. That is the version of Brianna Clarice would one day face without ever knowing why. Things shifted when Brianna met Evan. Evan was gentle, kind, the sort of man a woman like Brianna clung to in order to climb another rung in life. But Evan's warmth came with a shadow that unsettled Brianna more than anything else Clarice. A woman with no power, no wealth, yet someone Evan loved with an unshakable loyalty. In Brianna's world, such devotion meant one thing, a place she could never take. During their early days of dating, Evan often spoke of his mother with respect that softened every word he said. He talked about her laugh, the way she sensed when he was hurting without him explaining a thing. Those simple details made something tighten in Brianna's chest, because in her mind, that affection was a throne she couldn't occupy. And in Veronica's teachings, anything you cannot dominate, you must eliminate. Once Brianna married into the family, her unease turned into fixation. Clarice didn't do anything wrong. She was gentle, considerate, and at times timid, but that very kindness threatened Brianna. She began planting seeds of doubt in Evan's mind, delivering lines coded in false concern. "Your mother shows signs of confusion. I'm really worried about her." Evan believed her, never suspecting Brianna had twisted every observation to secure her place in his life. As time passed, Brianna carefully crafted situations where Clarice would appear forgetful or clumsy. A misplaced key here, a misunderstood story there, just enough for Evan to hesitate when his mother spoke. Brianna fed that hesitation, shaping Evan's perception until the woman who raised him no longer stood on stable ground. Clarice never understood why she felt judged in her own son's home, but Brianna savored every shift in Evan's expression. Veronica saw it all and pushed further. One evening before Christmas, the two stood in her kitchen. Veronica set her wine glass down with a thud and said, "Christmas is the perfect time. Humiliate Clarice. With the whole family watching, they'll take your side." Brianna didn't answer, but the look in her eyes was enough. Veronica knew her daughter was already convinced. Every snide comment, every carefully orchestrated moment where Clarice appeared out of place, every cut to her dignity began that night. And inside Veronica's house, where the two had plotted to erase Clarice, a tiny camera blinked quietly from a shelf, placed there long ago but forgotten. That same camera captured every mocking word, every insult, every plan spoken with smug satisfaction. Neither Brianna nor Veronica realized it, and that footage, tucked inside a memory card, waited like a blade, ready to slice through every mask Brianna had built around her lies. Clarice left Evan's house that night with a numb heaviness pressing against her chest. She drove like a shadow, her vision blurring now and then as everything she had just endured replayed in her mind. When she finally reached home, even her familiar kitchen couldn't offer comfort. She set the gift bag on the table and sank into a chair, her hands clasping together. She no longer knew what direction her life was supposed to take, but she knew one thing: she could not return to that house again. A sleepless night pushed Clarice to make a decision. The next morning, she booked a ticket to Prague, a place an old friend once told her could help a wounded heart breathe again. She had nothing left to cling to, and fleeing to a foreign city felt like her only escape. The plane carried her through a blanket of gray clouds, leaving behind the heaviness of a Christmas that had turned cruel. Prague greeted her with cold air, stone streets, and a slow rhythm that felt distant enough for her to hide inside. She rented a small room facing a quiet square and tried to blend into the unfamiliar calm. Every few hours, she checked her phone, avoiding messages from Evan or Brianna. She wasn't ready to be dragged back. Not yet. Everything shifted one afternoon when she received a message from Nora Bennett, her longtime friend. There was a video file attached, along with a short note: "Clarice, you need to see this." Clarice hesitated. She feared she didn't have the strength to face another blow. But she tapped the video anyway. The screen lit up with the living room inside Veronica's house shot on Christmas night. Brianna leaned against a table, holding a glass of wine. Her expression was stripped of the politeness she showed in front of Evan. Her voice was sharp. "She's useless, can't do anything right. All she ever does is get in the way." Clarice felt something tear inside her chest. Veronica laughed under her breath, her tone dripping with disdain. "Send her to a nursing home. Someone else can take care of her there instead of ruining our evening." The camera then captured Evan standing nearby, silent, avoiding eye contact, looking down at his drink. That silence wounded Clarice more deeply than any insult could. None of the words were new. They were the same sentiments she had already heard at the doorstep. But watching them again through a screen, seeing each smirk, each mocking glance, each shared cruelty, made the truth sharper. It felt like someone was pressing a cold blade straight into her chest and twisting. The wind from the square slipped into the room, making Clarice shiver. She pressed a hand to her chest as her breath hitched. Then the tears came, not loud, but steady. Alone in a foreign city, the pain from that recording crossed every distance to reach her. She whispered through trembling lips, "That's not a daughter-in-law, that's a knife." Clarice turned off the video and leaned back against the wall. She feared she might collapse under the weight of the humiliation, but instead of breaking something, inside hardened. She gazed out the window at the falling snow and realized she could not return home like this. She refused to be the version of herself that silently endured. She needed answers, real answers. She opened her email and stared at the return flight ticket. Then she tore it into pieces, letting them fall to the floor. She moved to a different hotel to avoid leaving a trail and decided to stay in Prague for at least another week. Clarice needed time to gather the loose strands she had ignored for years, including those tied to Harrison and Brianna's past. She placed Harrison's compass on the table and touched it gently. Its weight grounded her. Clarice understood that leaving America wasn't an escape, but the first step toward uncovering the truth she had overlooked. The pain she felt today would lead her toward the darkness she had been too trusting to see. Just as she set the compass down, her phone vibrated again. She thought it might be Nora or Evan and hesitated before checking, but the name on the screen stopped her breath. Brianna. The message contained 2 frantic lines, each word sharp. Why are you in Europe? Who told you? The air in the room seemed to tighten around Clarice as she read the message again. If Brianna was panicking this much, then the video was not the end of the truth, and whatever awaited Clarice next was going to be darker than anything she had just seen. That evening in Prague drained Clarice completely. She stepped into the hotel lobby intending to return to her room, but noticed the bar was still open, its warm yellow lights spilling over the wooden stools. Clarice took a seat and ordered a cup of hot tea, hoping the warmth would soften the blow of the video still echoing in her mind. The words from Brianna and Veronica replayed sharply, especially the image of Evan standing there silent, not defending her. She placed her hand over the compass Harrison had left for her, clinging to it as though it were the only steady thing left. An older man entered the bar, his posture steady despite his age. He chose the seat beside her, ordered a drink, then gently asked if she needed help after noticing her trembling hands. Clarice shook her head, but his gaze landed on the compass on the counter. She saw him freeze, his eyes widening as if something long buried had suddenly resurfaced. Adrian stared at the small object for a long moment, then whispered, "That compass, Harrison promised to return it to me if he ever—" He didn't finish. His voice caught the last words, dissolving into a breath heavy with memories. Clarice gripped the compass tighter, her heart clenching. Harrison had made promises she knew nothing about. She studied Adrian's face, trying to recognize something familiar, but couldn't. He set his glass down and softly asked for her name. When Clarice introduced herself, his expression changed, filled with a mix of recognition and regret. "I'm Adrian Cole," he said. "Harrison and I were kindred brothers in the army. He once saved my life, and he also hid many things from me." Clarice stiffened. Harrison had never mentioned having a friend close enough to be called a brother. She remembered him as warm, but private, carrying past memories he never fully shared. Clarice suddenly realized how much of him she hadn't known, not because he wanted distance, but because he believed those memories were too heavy for her. Adrian swirled his drink, his voice deepening, as though each sentence pulled up something from far back. "Harrison told me he had 2 regrets in his life. One concerned his older brother. The other," he paused, "was tied to Veronica." Hearing that name brought a sharp sting through Clarice. She leaned back, breath briefly caught, unable to imagine how Harrison's past could intertwine with the woman who had humiliated her so openly. He knew her long before, Adrian continued, and he feared she might return to your lives someday. Clarice said nothing, her mind racing to connect the fragments. She recalled Veronica's cold stare, her unwarranted hostility, her jabs that felt personal. Perhaps they were. Perhaps the resentment ran deeper than Clarice ever imagined. Adrian reached into his briefcase and pulled out a pale yellow envelope, edges softened by time. He placed it before her with deliberate care. "Harrison gave this to me," he said. "He told me to deliver it to you only if you ever left home without a clear reason." Clarice felt her hand tremble. Another envelope, another message from the man she had loved, kept hidden until the moment life forced it to surface. Only Adrian knew of its existence. The thought sent a shiver along her spine. She picked it up, feeling its weight heavier and thicker than the envelope she always carried. Inside might be truths Harrison didn't want her to face while he was alive, truths capable of reshaping everything she believed about her family. Her heartbeat echoed loudly as her finger traced the sealed edge. Adrian watched her with understanding rather than pity. "Harrison always believed you were stronger than you think," he said, "but he never wanted you to suffer before you were ready." Clarice wanted to tear the envelope open, but her hand stopped mid-air. She sensed whatever waited inside would change everything, and there would be no returning once she read it. Silence settled between them. Clarice set the envelope on her lap and gazed out the window. Prague at night was beautiful, almost tender, yet the peaceful view sharpened the storm gathering in her life. She never expected to unravel the remnants of Harrison's past, to follow threads he had hidden so carefully. She turned to Adrian again, urging him gently for any clue that could help her understand what Harrison had feared. Adrian exhaled, pushed his glass aside, and placed both hands on the counter as if bracing himself. His next words came slow, but each one landed with the precision of a blade. "Clarice," he said, holding her gaze, "Evan is in danger, and you don't know it yet." The sentence sliced through her. Clarice tightened her grip on the envelope until its edges bent, realizing the trip to Europe was never about escaping the pain. It was the beginning of a reckoning waiting for her to return. Clarice sat quietly in the hotel room after Adrian's final words faded. What he said about Evan felt like a plunge into darkness. Her hand stayed on the envelope Harrison left behind, the paper inside suddenly feeling heavier. She tried to steady her breath, but her heart trembled with the instinctive fear of a mother sensing danger surrounding her child. Clarice lifted her head, looked at Adrian, and slowly opened the envelope, careful not to tear a single stroke of Harrison's handwriting. The paper had yellowed, but Harrison's handwriting remained strong, as if he were standing right in front of her. The very first line tightened her grip on the letter. Harrison wrote that he never shared these things because he knew it would burden her. But if the letter ever reached Clarice, it meant the fear he carried had begun to unfold. She read slowly each sentence, sinking deeper inside her, unlocking truths she had never imagined. Harrison wrote about Veronica first. He had met her when he was young in a situation he never shared with anyone except Adrian. He described her as sharp, cold, and dangerously intelligent, someone who could twist a person's mind by using their weaknesses, their emotions, and even their insecurities. Harrison wrote, "Veronica is not just toxic, she can manipulate people's minds." Clarice lowered the letter for a moment and closed her eyes. Everything she had ever sensed about Veronica suddenly had clarity. The unprovoked hostility, the cutting remarks, the way Veronica always stood behind Brianna like a strategist moving her pawn forward. None of it was coincidence. Clarice finally understood the invisible grip she always felt around her chest whenever that woman was in the room. She continued reading, and the next part made her chest tighten. Harrison spoke of Evan and the worry he carried in silence. Evan inherited Clarice's gentle heart, making him vulnerable to manipulation from people who knew how to twist affection into leverage. Harrison feared that after he died, someone could reach Evan through those he loved, and that someone, in his eyes, had always been Veronica. Harrison wrote, "If the day comes when Clarice is pushed out of the family, the storm has begun." Clarice reread the sentence slowly, feeling tears stinging her eyes. Harrison had predicted everything, even the night she was humiliated at the doorstep. He had seen the fracture long before it broke. She placed her hand over his words, feeling his presence through the page, remembering how he used to steady her by placing a hand on her shoulder whenever she faltered. When she folded the letter again, Clarice felt as if she had been awakened. The pain she carried no longer bowed her head. It straightened her spine. She stood up, her posture firm, her eyes glowing with the strength of a mother who had reached her limit. She slipped the letter into her bag, smoothing the creases, and said quietly but with resolve, "No one is tearing my family apart anymore." Adrian watched the shift in her expression. He knew this letter could wound her, but he also knew it would clarify the real war she had walked into, a war far beyond verbal insults on Christmas night. He saw Clarice walk toward the window, her silhouette facing Prague's gentle lights, while a storm gathered inside her. She didn't turn around when she spoke. "Adrian, what else did Harrison tell you that I don't know?" Adrian hesitated. The silence stretched long enough for Clarice to look back at him. When their eyes met, she saw something in his expression that made her pulse quicken: regret, worry, and the weight of another truth he had been holding. Adrian stepped forward, placing a hand on the table as if he needed the grounding. His voice softened, each word carrying the heaviness of something long hidden. "Clarice," he said, pausing, "there's something you need to know, something urgent, because it involves Evan." Clarice held her breath. The world narrowed into the space between them. Adrian looked straight into her eyes. "Clarice, Brianna forged your signature." The room seemed to freeze, and Clarice understood that everything she thought she had already survived was merely the beginning of a much darker storm. The message Adrian revealed about the forged signature left Clarice unable to stay still any longer. She immediately called Evan. For the first time in days, he picked up the moment it rang. His voice trembled, likely because he had begun to suspect that Clarice's trip to Europe was not the vacation Brianna described. Clarice told him to find a quiet place. When she heard the car door close on his end, she sent him the video, the recording that exposed everything at Veronica's house. Evan said nothing for the first few minutes. Clarice stood in her hotel room, gripping her phone as time stretched painfully slow. When she finally heard his breath break, she knew he had reached the part where Brianna sneered that she was useless and Veronica said to put her in a nursing home. Clarice listened to the sound of him collapsing against the steering wheel. Moments later, his voice cracked through the speaker, raw and shaking. "Mom, I let them kill you with their words." The sentence pierced Clarice. Evan wasn't cruel, but his silence that Christmas night had wounded her deeper than Brianna's insults. She drew a breath, steadying her voice despite the ache in her chest. "Evan," she said, "you stayed silent because you thought it kept the peace. But silence isn't love. Silence is complicity." On the other end, Evan broke down, the way a man breaks when he finally sees the dark corners of himself. After the call, Evan drove to Veronica's house. He needed answers directly from Brianna, needed to hear from her mouth why she had gone that far. But instead of panic, Brianna greeted him with practiced calm. She denied the video, called it edited, staged, then twisted the story into a claim that Clarice was manipulating him to ruin their marriage. Evan stared at his wife, his eyes no longer soft. "Brianna, tell me the truth. Who started the story about my mother losing her memory?" The question caused a flicker across Brianna's face, though she tried to hide it under Veronica's sharp gaze. "I was worried about her," she insisted. But when Evan pressed her, her voice faltered, and Veronica's silent gestures told him everything he needed to know. That evening, Clarice sent Evan additional files. A bank statement showing transactions from the supplementary card under Clarice's account. Evan stared at the long list: luxury items, expensive dinners, transfers he had never authorized, all under Brianna's name. His throat tightened. His sense of dignity felt crushed in an instant. Then Clarice sent another image, a scanned loan document. The signature at the bottom was almost identical to hers, but just wrong enough for her to recognize it was forged. Evan leaned against the counter, trembling. She really did that. His voice was barely audible. Clarice steadied herself. Before answering, "Brianna claimed I was forgetful, so you wouldn't question what she was doing." Evan felt something collapse inside him. The tears, the heartfelt speeches Brianna made about worrying for Clarice, all of them were carefully placed stones to cage him in. He thought back to Christmas Eve, to his mother standing outside the house with a brave smile despite being humiliated, and he had stayed quiet. Clarice heard him struggling to breathe. She knew he was facing the truth about the woman he built a life with. The years of subtle manipulation, the slow rewriting of Clarice's image, the emotional traps he never recognized. Evan was finally seeing them laid bare. Their calls stretched long into the night. Neither wanted to hang up. Eventually, Evan spoke again, voice hoarse but steady, with new resolve. "Mom, I need you home. I want everything cleaned out. I want to face them knowing I'm standing with you." Clarice closed her eyes, feeling something inside her shift. The scattered pieces of the last weeks were coming together, forming a version of her that was no longer willing to break. But before she could reply, Evan added, voice cracking with guilt, "I'm scared. I still don't know everything she did." Clarice placed a hand on her chest, feeling Harrison's warning echo through her. She opened her eyes and looked out over the amber streetlights. Her voice, when she finally spoke, held none of the tremor it once had. "Evan, get ready." She took a breath, each word sharp with purpose. "We're going back to America. I'm ending this." The sentence hung in the room like the click of a trigger, marking the beginning of a confrontation that Brianna and Veronica never expected and would never be able to escape. Clarice returned to the U.S. at dawn, the long flight leaving her eyes burning, but her spirit clearer than at any point in recent years. Evan waited for her at the airport, his face drained but determined. He didn't say much, only one short sentence, "Mom, I'm here." Clarice placed a hand on his shoulder, and that simple warmth steadied her for what she was about to do. They got into the car and drove straight to Veronica's house, where Clarice knew Brianna was hiding behind the walls her mother had built for years. When the door opened, Veronica stood in the foyer, her stare sharpening the moment she saw Clarice. Brianna stood behind her, attempting to stay calm, though her hands trembled beneath her sleeves. Evan didn't look at his wife, his face colder than ever. Clarice saw not two women who had tossed careless insults at her, but two who had dragged her family into the darkest place it had ever been. She stepped forward, set her bag down on the table, and pulled out her phone. She opened the video recorded at Veronica's house on Christmas night. Brianna's voice spilled from the speaker, each word sharp with contempt. "She's useless, can't do anything right." Then Veronica's voice followed, send her to a nursing home. The room tightened as their own cruelty echoed through the air. Veronica took a step forward, but Clarice raised her hand to stop her, her gaze as sharp as a blade honed to perfection. "You didn't want me old, you wanted me gone." No one spoke. Clarice continued showing screenshots of the unauthorized transactions from the secondary credit card, the loans taken under her name with a forged signature, and the bank reports that confirmed the financial abuse. She didn't raise her voice. She let every piece of evidence speak for itself. Evan stared at his wife, a look of heartbreak mixed with disbelief. He realized Brianna had not only lied, but had taken advantage of his gentleness to hurt the woman who raised him. Veronica faltered first. She stepped forward, her voice shaky. I only wanted to protect my daughter." Clarice met her eyes with a calm precision. "No, you wanted to protect your ego," she said. "You protected the power you used to control everyone around you." Veronica's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Clarice's words had stripped away the polished mask she wore, revealing a woman trembling at the thought of losing control. Brianna could no longer hold her composure. She looked at her mother, then at Evan, panic spreading across her face as every wall she leaned on began to crumble. Clarice stood before her, not angry, not shouting, simply letting silence force Brianna to face the truth she'd buried. And that made her break. Brianna collapsed into tears, hands pressed to her forehead, as if trying to hide her unraveling expression. "I did it because I was afraid Evan would leave me," she cried, her voice raw. "Because Mom told me I had to be stronger than every other woman. I always felt like I wasn't enough. I didn't want to lose to anyone, even my mother-in-law." Tears didn't erase what she had done. Evan watched her with eyes full of pain, yet firm, as if seeing a stranger standing in front of him. Clarice listened, but she didn't mistake Brianna's panic for repentance. It was fear. Fear of losing her advantage, fear of finally being exposed. Clarice opened her bag and took out the documents sent by Prosecutor Reed earlier that morning. She placed them on the table, her voice steady, shaped by resolve rather than emotion. "I've given all the evidence to the attorney and the prosecutor," Clarice said. "This isn't revenge. This is protecting my family from the cruelty you've cultivated." Veronica moved as if to grab her daughter's hand, but Evan stepped between them, blocking her for the first time in his life. The room thickened, every breath audible. Clarice looked at Brianna, seeing not remorse, but dread creeping through her expression. Clarice recognized that fear. It was the fear of being unmasked, nothing more. Then a loud knock shattered the silence. Brianna flinched, Veronica stiffened. Evan looked through the peehole, then turned back, pale as paper. Clarice already knew what was coming, yet she stood tall, her calm the quiet center of the storm. The door opened. A police officer and Prosecutor Reed stepped inside. The officer held a stack of documents, his voice firm and unmistakable. "Brianna Hayes, you are under investigation for forgery, misappropriation, and financial abuse." The room erupted in chaos, and in that moment, Clarice understood that the war she had stepped into had reached a point beyond return. But it was also the first time she saw a path for her family to be free from the poison that had shrouded it for far too long. After the warrant was read aloud, the atmosphere in the room thickened into something heavy enough to hear each breath stretching. Brianna stumbled back, her spine hitting the edge of a chair, her eyes widening as if reality had ripped away the floor beneath her feet. Evan stood beside Clarice, his face carrying both pain and resolve. Clarice fought in his eyes no confusion, no hesitation, only the awakening of someone who had finally faced the truth about the person he once loved. The officer held out his hand, demanding Brianna's cooperation as the investigation began. Brianna collapsed, gripping the carpet as though it could anchor her. She looked up, her voice breaking into a plea. "Clarice, please don't let them take me." Her words were tangled in fear and desperation, the sound of a woman watching the walls she built crumble. Clarice met her gaze, her voice calm and steady. "I'm not taking revenge. I'm protecting myself." Veronica rushed forward, raising her hand toward her daughter, but Evan stepped between them. It stunned Veronica. It was the first time Evan had ever refused to bend beneath her heavy, manipulative presence. He turned to the officers and nodded, signaling them to continue. Their footsteps echoed through the room, each one pounding against the very lies Brianna had crafted. Clarice stayed still, her presence firm enough to pull every mask off the truth. The investigation advanced faster than Brianna could have imagined. Officers collected documents confirming the forged signature financial extraction through the secondary card and debt taken under Clarice's name. No excuse could cover the evidence. Brianna was escorted out, her hair disheveled and mascara streaking down her face, the complete opposite of the woman who once stood at the Christmas door and humiliated Clarice. Veronica watched helplessly, her trembling hands unable to muster a single argument. That night marked the fracture in the family. Evan spent hours beside his mother, confessing his guilt for the silence that had wounded her more deeply than Brianna's insults ever could. Clarice placed a hand on his shoulder, neither scolding nor softening the truth. Evan knew he had to rebuild not just his relationship with Clarice, but the integrity of his own life, particularly the marriage he had once shielded without questioning. The next morning, Evan visited Brianna in the lawyer's office. She was released pending investigation, her face swollen from crying. When Evan entered, she stood abruptly, grabbing his sleeve. "Evan, I was wrong. I did it because I love you." But Evan had shed the weakness that had kept him blind. He stepped back. His voice was firm and cold. 6 months of separation, mandatory therapy, one more mistake, divorce. The declaration shut a door Brianna had clung to like her last breath. She turned to Veronica for help, but even her mother had no words left. What they had done was no longer a matter of manipulation. It had become a legal firestorm too big to hide. From that moment, Evan set the boundary he had never dared draw. News of the investigation spread quickly through the neighborhood. Whispers followed Brianna in every store, cafe, and school where she once worked. The company she worked for, alerted by the prosecutor's office, terminated her employment immediately. The carefully crafted image she used to parade in public evaporated. Veronica didn't escape consequences either. Her relatives, long used to her control at family gatherings, cut ties after seeing the video. They refused to be associated with someone who pushed her daughter into criminal behavior. Politeness turned into avoidance, and soon Veronica found herself alone in a house echoing with her own choices. As for Brianna, every step outside her home came with hushed voices behind her. The woman who scammed her mother-in-law. Some neighbors didn't bother whispering. They said it aloud as they walked past, forcing Brianna to bow her head and quicken her pace. Every word was a stone bouncing off the truth she had tried to bury. Clarice didn't feel triumphant, nor did she feel sorry. Truth, once exposed, no longer belonged to the victim. It became a mirror for the guilty. She spent time with Evan in the days that followed, helping him gather the pieces Brianna had broken inside him. Their conversations were open, unfiltered, rebuilding what manipulation had tried to dismantle. One evening, while Clarice sat in Evan's living room, Prosecutor Reed arrived. He carried a folder and a faint understanding smile. "Mrs. Clarice, I'm here to discuss the case progress," he said. Clarice nodded, but Reed placed a different envelope on the table, older, sealed, and worn. He slid it toward her. "Harrison left you another document." The room fell into a new silence, not one filled with pain, but one filled with the weight of a secret that was waiting to be opened. The day of the sentencing came faster than Brianna expected. She stood in the courtroom, fingers interlocked, until they turned pale, her face worn out after weeks of stress and being shunned by the community. Clarice and Evan sat in the back row, not facing her yet. Their presence alone made Brianna tremble. The judge read the verdict with firm clarity, each word closing the door on the chain of mistakes Brianna had made. Brianna received 12 months of suspended sentence, 200 hours of community service, and mandatory counseling. More importantly, her access to the trust fund was revoked for a full year, the very thing she once relied on to secure her place in Evan's family. Veronica stood behind her daughter, her once proud expression nowhere to be seen. When the judge required the guardian to publicly apologize, Veronica stepped up, hands shaking. She bowed and said the apology no one ever thought they would hear from her. No one clapped, no one gloated. Everything took place in a heavy yet fair atmosphere. Clarice looked at the two women, recalling the nights she had been slandered, driven out of her own family with cruel words. Yet in that moment, she felt something different within her, a lightness she hadn't known in years. The law had done its part, and now their lives would continue based on how they faced their own truths. After the hearing, Evan supported Clarice to the car. He had changed so much since the truth broke open. His eyes no longer carried hesitance, but the firmness of someone who understood the importance of protecting those he loves. He apologized to his mother sincerely with no excuses. Clarice saw her son becoming again the man Harrison once believed in, and that brought her more warmth than anything else. A few weeks later, Veronica began her court-ordered psychological therapy. At first, she resisted, but after several sessions of confronting herself, her sharpness softened, replaced by the weary realization that she had used the wrong way to love her daughter for years. Brianna, during the time she lost all her advantages, began to recognize the wounds she carried and the way she had spread them onto others. Her community service sessions forced her to face the pride that once pushed her to hurt Clarice. Meanwhile, Evan spent more time with Clarice. He invited her to live with him for a while so they could heal the gap between them. Clarice agreed, but she also kept part of her independent life because she knew she had survived a journey where independence made her stronger. Evan grew warmer, more mature, better at setting boundaries against toxicity. It was something Clarice knew Harrison would have been proud to see. A year passed, and when Christmas returned, Evan's house lit up earlier than usual. Clarice prepared gingerbread not to prove anything, but to share genuine joy. Adrian arrived too, his calm presence bringing an extra layer of warmth into the home. Clarice blushed slightly when Evan noticed how Adrian gently placed a hand on her shoulder, but instead of hiding it, she simply smiled. The Christmas dinner unfolded under soft golden lights. Clarice sat at the head of the table, Adrian quietly holding her hand beneath it, a silent promise that she would never have to walk alone again. Evan stood up, raised his glass, and thanked his mother for giving him the chance to fix his mistakes. The room fell silent for a moment, not out of tension, but gratitude toward the woman who had endured so much yet remained strong enough to bring the family back together. After the meal, Clarice opened the journal she had kept for years. She wrote lines that were simple yet deeply felt. "Forgiveness is not for them, but for myself. I want to enter the next chapter without carrying old wounds." Her eyes grew moist, but it was the kind of sting that came with release, not pain. Later that night, Adrian stood beside her at the door, holding a small suitcase. He looked at her with warm eyes. "Ready?" he asked in a low, hopeful voice. Clarice tilted her head, a soft smile lighting her face. "Paris is waiting," she said, and the words rang like a declaration that her life was finally back on the path it deserved. Evan hugged his mother tightly before she stepped outside. The house behind her glowed with Christmas lights, while ahead the road stretched long and open. Clarice and Adrian pulled their suitcases into the calm night, stepping into the beginning of a new chapter that belonged wholly to them. As the car rolled past the last line of Christmas lights, Clarice saw her reflection on the window and allowed herself a small smile. She once believed she had lost her family, her faith, and the part of her heart that had withered under years of hurt. But what she thought was an ending was simply the doorway to the strongest version of herself. And in that quiet moment, she understood a truth she had never been brave enough to face before. Freedom doesn't come when you walk away from those who hurt you, but when you become strong enough to stop carrying their hurt inside you. That Christmas didn't take anything from her. It simply returned to her the woman she had forgotten she could be. And as Paris appeared beneath the night sky, she whispered to her new beginning, "Life doesn't change when we fight the storm, but when we learn to keep walking long after the storm has passed."